Yeah, we got here like half an hour.
Timeline and frequently asked questions. And so there is also a link for an information session on that on the webpage. And then looks like we'll have another round of funding for the local planning capacity grant program in the spring, opening in January. We'll get more information about that up as we get closer. But you can always go to the local planning capacity page for more information about that. And you can also find past presentations from the Housing Peer Exchange on our webpage for if you're looking for any information from our last session. All right. I think with that, go ahead to the next slide. So I'm going to now turn it over to Mark Williams to take over and guide us through our session today.
Thanks, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to be here. My name's Mark Williams, so I'll kick us off. I'm the lead land use technical assistance planner, and then we'll be joined today by Amanda Ufile Summers from Echo Northwest. She was one of the main authors for a lot of our guidance, including the displacement mitigation guidance. Then Brad Calvert, principal planner for the city of Steamboat Springs, to talk about some of the things they're doing in Steamboat. Eugene Howard, who's our technical assistance unit manager, to talk about displacement as it relates to transit-oriented communities from House Bill 24-1313. And then Ashley Basham to talk about grant funding opportunities. So just some basics about displacement before we really get started, in case you're not really that familiar with the concept. So when is this displacement stuff required? Governments doing housing action plans or transit-oriented community plans have to use these strategies in those plans. Displacement strategies are used with affordability strategies. And in fact, they're in the same guidance document. But there's so much information and there's so many different strategies, we thought it was worthwhile to separate out these two subjects. And we'll have another webinar about affordability strategies coming up in a few weeks. And you would also use your displacement analysis from the housing needs assessments when you're doing housing action plans, especially. There's a lot of other guidance on our page, and you can see the link down there at the bottom. There's a displacement guide, which talks about what displacement is more generally, and the strategies are more specific about actions. There's a regional resources study, as well as other resources. Oops. Okay, so what is displacement? This is really just a general definition or concept. So involuntary relocation of residents, closure of local businesses, or relocation of community institutions is typically, but not always, driven by social or economic forces that alter the character and affordability of areas. Could be other things. And it's usually related to economic pressures of either strong growth or disinvestment and gentrification. So it could be from a lot of growth or little growth. We originally had the definition for displacement from SB 24174 in this webinar, but it took up 3 full pages with text. And so I thought, no one's going to remember that, so let's just pull out some of the highlights. But you should go back into the documents and the statute themselves to read through these. But generally speaking, for displacement as it is defined in Colorado, is it affects businesses, institutions, and mostly low-income residents. It's caused by rising real estate prices, but also other factors. It's a loss of housing or commercial space from neglect or property rehabilitation. It could be redevelopment or demolition as well. It's related to changes when new residents price out current residents in neighborhoods. And it's also related to changes when residents follow their relocated community institutions. So that might be a church moving out of one neighborhood to another. So where is displacement? No matter where you are in Colorado, this is something that could affect your community, but for different reasons. Denver is one of the most gentrified cities in America, according to at least one study. And if you're in the mountains, in the mountain town, I think it's no surprise that real estate there is really expensive. So that's a different kind of displacement pressure on real estate prices. But also it affects the Eastern Plains for different reasons. So population loss and some of the accompanying economic challenges related to that is also under the umbrella of displacement. So more generally, concept of displacement is it's involuntary for the people that it affects. It already affects Colorado, as we just talked about on the previous slide, but maybe as a planner, you don't think of it in terms of displacement. It might be you're looking at affordable housing issues. So displacement can help frame these or reframe this issue more broadly. It's related to a lack of new investment, but also a lack of equitable investment. And then one of the primary impacts is on the residents, businesses, and community institutions, which are all the neighborhood glue. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are two different bills or laws that have displacement mitigation requirements. One is HB 24-1313, transit-oriented communities, and then the other is SB 24-174 for housing action plans. So the some of the requirements and details between these two statutes and laws are different. So you'll need to read through each of those statutes accordingly. But the displacement mitigation strategies apply generally to both laws with some exceptions. And Amanda is going to go through that first. And then in SB 24-174, I focus on that a little bit more because I work on 174, but not 1313. So if you are working on a housing action plan, it's going to be a narrative analysis of any area or community that the local government has identified as being at elevated risk of displacement. And if you've already done a housing needs assessment, you'll remember that you had to go through some displacement risk data sets to come up with identifying those areas that are at an elevated risk of displacement. And then my last slide is, as always, let us hear from you. This is a new concept for a lot of people. It's a new concept for the state of Colorado to be looking at this so broadly. These laws were only passed last year. So if there are things that you think we should mention or that we didn't mention that would be helpful, let us know. And sometimes these become FAQs on our FAQ page. And so they'll help other governments as they go through this same process. And there's a link to our FAQs at the bottom of this page if you haven't seen it yet. So at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Amanda.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone. My name is Amanda Ufile Summers. I'm a project manager with Echo Northwest. And as Mark said, we've been working with DOLA to create guidance for jurisdictions implementing the suite of land use legislation that was passed in 2024. And that includes the guidance related to mitigating displacement. So if we go to the, great. So there are two primary elements related to displacement that's part of these new processes. The first is assessing displacement risk in your community, and the second is choosing strategies that mitigate and prevent displacement to include in your housing action plan or housing opportunity goal report. Today, I'm mostly going to be focusing on mitigation strategies, which is the last step in the process that's shown in the graphic here. But I encourage everyone to take a look at the guidance for assessing displacement risk on DOLA's housing plans website. So Mark very helpfully grounded us in the definition of displacement that guides the legislation. I also just wanted to reiterate how critical it is to recognize that displacement isn't limited to a specific type of community, because any household can experience displacement. All communities have a mix of residents with different incomes, identities, and life circumstances that affect their ability to find housing or a place of business that meets their needs. And all those things also affect their ability to stay in place for as long as they want. And at a neighborhood and community level, as Mark was saying, the way that displacement pressure shows up can look really different. It can be related to rising land and housing costs, redevelopment. In other places, it can be a shortage of available housing and competition between year-round residents and part-time residents or visitors. In other places, losing a major employer can cause displacement from the community as people relocate to find work. So the displacement risk assessment is really an opportunity to determine the specific pressures that residents and businesses in your community are experiencing, to identify strategies that are going to address those specific needs and keep those folks stable and rooted. So we go to the next slide. SB 24174 and HB 241313 name specific kinds of strategies that can be adopted as part of your housing plans. This is the full list that's named across both of those pieces of legislation, and there's guidance about each one of these in DOLA's resources. But I really want to stress that this is in no way the full universe of strategies and actions that can address displacement. Both pieces of legislation acknowledge that other strategies can be selected, and I encourage you all to reach out to DOLA and talk about the policies and programs you may already have in place, or strategies that you're considering that might better reflect and meet your community's needs as you're going through the assessment and strategy process. And as these plans are submitted, DOLA will hopefully be able to build up a library of additional strategies and case studies for jurisdictions across the state to learn from one another. But just to spend another moment on this list, these named strategies offer a lot of different entry points for jurisdictions to get started on or to continue anti-displacement work. And I think you can group them and categorize these in a variety of ways. Some are place-based, some are more universal, some are tools that might be a good fit for communities seeing a lot of new construction and investment, while others might be better for places that have displacement pressure without new investment. So the suite of what is named and sort of provided with supportive guidance really has different options for different communities. Let's go to the next slide. I think one helpful way of thinking about the different options of what might work for you is thinking about how each of these strategies intervenes in the process of displacement. So some are focused on supporting and stabilizing households by providing direct assistance to keep housing or find more secure housing. These are programs that can serve a really wide range of different communities. They can be implemented at different scales. And they're programs where even small investments can make a really big difference for the people that benefit from them. There are also a set of strategies that are about investing in keeping affordable housing and local businesses in place. So these are a little bit more focused on building up a supply of affordable and attainable housing, give people in your community more options and stability. But because these are a little bit more focused on the sort of the stock, these strategies might require more resources and partnerships compared to others. And then another group of strategies are more on the regulatory side to ensure that any development that's happening in your community is providing benefits that help neighborhoods grow and change without displacing the people who currently live there. So that's just an overview, but I wanted to talk through one of these strategies and just sort of give a flavor of the kind of information that's available in the strategy guidance document and how you can start thinking about what might work for your community. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, let's talk about preserving affordable housing. So first of all, what is this? If you have regulated affordable housing in your community, this is about making sure those buildings do not convert to market rate units, either because the affordability covenant is going to expire or because the property is in distress. And even if you don't have regulated affordable housing, every community likely has unregulated affordable housing. Sometimes that's called naturally occurring affordable housing. And this is just market rate housing that is more affordable, maybe because it's older or smaller or needs some repair. So this strategy is really about protecting that part of your housing supply and making it affordable for the long term, such as through a deed restriction. Why might this strategy be good for your community? When these conversions to market rate or higher rents happen, they are likely to cause mass displacement of multiple households. So preventing that from happening is a really important stabilization tool for those households and even for a whole neighborhood. And also in a tough development environment, preserving existing housing can be much more efficient, cheaper, faster than adding new affordable housing to keep folks in your community. And of course, preservation is an especially important strategy for jurisdictions that are land constrained or are not seeing a lot of new development. So let's go to the next slide. Where are some good places to start with this? I think really key for this strategy is thinking about the landscape of this type of housing on the ground. Where are the properties? Who are the owners? Who are the operators? Some affordable housing is owned and operated by nonprofits, and they intend to maintain that affordability forever, but they might be struggling financially in the near term. On the other hand, a lot of affordable housing is developed by for-profit companies, and they intend to sell it or convert it to market rate when that mandatory affordability restriction expires. So understanding who those people are, those operators, will help you understand what might be needed in terms of resources and partners to protect those properties for the long term. For unregulated affordable housing, just being aware of where those properties are, their conditions, what's happening in the neighborhood around them are really important first steps. Where has this been successful? Fort Collins brought resources to the table to keep one affordable housing development from converting to market rate, and that actually accounted for 15% of the city's affordable housing supply. So that is a major win for that community. And then Vail also has a program that purchases deed restrictions on properties, and that deed restriction requires that the owners or the people that the homes are rented to work in Eagle County. So that program has preserved 176 homes so far, probably a little more at this point, for full-time residents in the community. So this is the kind of information that's available for all of the strategies listed, and I hope that you'll refer to that guidance and find some helpful resources there. And happy to answer questions more later today. And I think I'm passing it off now to Brad.
Thanks, Amanda. Mark, since I can see you, give me a thumbs up that my audio is coming through.
Yes.
Awesome, perfect. Morning, everyone. Brad Calvert. I am with the City of Steamboat Springs. I have been with the city since sort of early 2022. Full disclosure, I'm giving you very high level content today. Much of what you're seeing in these 7 or 8 slides essentially are part of my waking hours every single day. So trying to cover them in 9 minutes or whatever means I'm going to go real high level. So we can have more discussion in the conversation a little bit later, but people can reach out to me anytime. So I very clearly put a big bold disclaimer slide in here just so that the audience knows that we have not, as a city, actually created a Senate Bill 24-174 compliant housing needs assessment and the associated displacement risk assessment. Everything that I'm talking about is either ongoing or has been contemplated through existing policies and plans that we've been working on for the past few years. I believe much of what I'm talking about is consistent with the intent of the expectation, but I just wanted folks to sort of understand it's not coming naturally from essentially those required elements, but hopefully the overall intent is consistent and helpful for the conversation. You go to the next slide. So our local housing authority recently completed a housing market demand study that I was particularly involved with in part because it's a good springboard to the housing needs assessment work that we need to do next year. I probably could have picked 10 slides of data or observations that essentially suggest that our housing market is, if not significantly impaired, broken as it relates to sort of meeting the needs of our local workforce. So here's just some of those that are on the slide that I'll kind of give you some examples. I mean, the general finding is that in some ways our housing market is actually detached from the local workforce. We have our stock is essentially 50-50 split between local workforce housing and other types of uses, whether that be seasonal or recreational or short-term rentals. The gap between what a standard 2-person, 100% AMI household can afford and what the median home price is, that gap is nearly $1 million. And if you think about the velocity of sales that happen in our community and you realize that 50% of those sales are to cash buyers, that suggests obviously a very real disconnect between those transactions and our local workforce. And then the final bullet just is almost in some ways sort of the indicator of displacement. we're actually seeing decreases in households earning 160% AMI and below, and increases in those earning more than that figure. Really, the demographic that we feel like is bearing the brunt of this from a displacement standpoint are those in the 25 to 44 year old demographic. Next slide. Our efforts to sort of regulate short-term rentals is sort of several years in the making, and generally kind of occurred in the sort of 22, 23 timeframe. The main thing that I wanted to sort of mention on this slide is that this really was in many ways about sort of stabilizing the housing market and creating more housing security. The proliferation of short-term rentals was having a very real and observable impact on our housing supply, particularly as it relates to folks that otherwise would be in long-term rentals. And so this was a very important first step to essentially do the biggest possible thing that we could do to stabilize the market, because you had many households in long-term rental arrangements that not only faced housing insecurity from dramatic increases in rent, but also essentially conversion of that unit to a short-term rental. So that's one of the things that we've been focusing on for the past few years. You go to the next slide. Back last year, we adopted a housing strategy and action plan as supported by DOLA. And it does a lot of things. There's lots of things in the document, but sort of the two bullets at the bottom of the slide are kind of the most critical things. What it really does is kind of orients our city's capacity towards addressing housing needs. I can't actually sort of today even suggest that we have what I would call a mature housing division or even a housing program. We're still very much muddling through and trying to figure out how to direct capacity to have the most impact on our current housing system. And it's very clear how important, and Amanda sort of pointed to this, that partnerships are. Partnerships between the city and the housing authority, and generally creating a robust ecosystem of many partners that are working to deliver affordability in an otherwise high-cost housing market. Next slide. So I'm not quite sure how many folks are on the call are familiar with sort of the Brown Ranch proposal that our community has been working through over the past few years. I'll spare you the gory details, but short version, our housing authority, through a generous donation, has site control of 400 to 500 acres of property on the west side of town. They proposed a relatively ambitious, in fact, a very ambitious plan to build 2,000 or so affordable and attainable units, requiring annexation into the city of Steamboat Springs. That proposal and the associated annexation agreement were rejected by the voters in Steamboat Springs. And so we've been in the aftermath sort of figuring out how to essentially take advantage of, in some ways, an unprecedented opportunity in Colorado and frankly across the country, and have been really leaning into sort of community dialogue and deliberation to understand if there is a path forward for this project. And we're in the middle of kind of the current project, and I would say the key takeaways is that we actually have a fair amount of agreement across the community on the importance of housing in our community, the needs, that the site is developable, what a successful version of Brown Ranch looks like, and that in many ways we have nuanced differences of opinions rather than true division. And that actually sets us up well for future deliberation, because we actually do have a lot of methods and means that we can use to find common ground in the community. Next slide. Go to the next one, Mark. Or
Sorry, is that the right one?
it's hanging up for me. Let's see if it catches up.
Is it short-term rental tax?
Okay, there we go. I'm good. I'm there.
Okay.
So as part of the Brown Ranch conversation, sort of the previous version, it was clear essentially the realities of the gap between what it would take to build that project, and during that conversation, the voters approved a new revenue vehicle to support affordable and attainable housing through a tax on short-term rentals. And so this is the primary tool in the toolbox that we're using right now to really sort of get at the production side of things. You can kind of see a little bit about the fund balance information on the slide. We're generally seeing about $15 million a year in revenue for the fund, very specifically about increasing the stock. So very much a production strategy. Next slide.
Sorry, it's hanging up for some reason. Here we go.
We'll get there. So just a few examples of deploying those funds and putting the funding to work. I won't cover all of these, but I really just kind of want to give kind of a sense of the diversity of the types of investments we're making on the production side. We are investing in our housing authority's current project. It's actually the first affordable home ownership project that's been built in Steamboat Springs in the last 15 or 20 years. We are providing operating subsidies to market rate developers to buy down market rate rents to affordable rents. We've been an investor in a project that essentially helped a senior living facility continue to operate by formalizing 15 workforce units, really for visiting nurses and other employees of the facility. We are made a loan to a market rate developer to bring 80% AMI units to market, including units for city employees, as well as a tenant waterfall for other community partners. Currently working with folks in the education sector to build teacher-related housing. And any other things as you see on the slide, including sort of a recent project that we're evaluating that received multiple development incentives to build workforce housing, but when you get to the financing structure of the deal, there's still a shortfall to be able to build those units. Next slide.
Okay, we're working on it.
Yeah, you're good.
Don't know why it's not. There we go. Okay.
So just kind of the laundry list of things that we're sort of working on right now. Amanda sort of pointed to sort of purchase of deed restriction programs. We are working on that. What's unique about what we're doing right now in our program design phase is that we're actively working with community partners, be it particularly sort of local employers that essentially have built affordable housing that have no affordability mechanism associated with them. So how can we formalize that mechanism and allow them to monetize that mechanism in some ways so they can actually build sort of their next phase of affordable housing. Currently exploring inclusionary housing and linkage fee, in part to diversify our revenue sources to do what's on the bottom of the slide. There's been a lot of support and need for emergency rental assistance. Our existing community partner that offers that program, the program is oversubscribed. The funds are essentially spent down by the midpoint of the year. So how can we create that nexus that allows us to support things that are more on the stabilization side of things versus just the production side of things, because our current revenue source through that STR tax is earmarked for production-based strategies. So we're just looking for every possible way to find additional revenue sources to do some of the stabilization work that Amanda described. So that's it for kind of the things I'm going to cover. So I'll turn it over to Eugene.
All right, Brad, man, you guys are really busy up there in Steamboat. So thank you for that overview. There will be a consistent theme that y'all will hear as we transition over to House Bill 24-1313, the Transit-Oriented Communities Planning Law. So one of the key goals of this is to really, as you've been hearing all morning, is really to protect and look to strategies to help stabilize vulnerable residents. And in the case of TOC, the Transit-Oriented Communities Law, also businesses. So I think we all have seen where transit gets expanded, that it often goes into
Listening to a DOLA webinar.
areas
I'm so
of
sorry.
our cities. And they're often placed in communities where, we have existing people and residents and businesses. So, as we make these transit investments, we really want to make sure that we are looking at ways to protect those who are already in those locations. And really, the goal of displacement mitigation as it relates to transit-oriented communities is really serving our vulnerable populations. As you'll see in the next slide, we are really focused on, as I mentioned a moment ago, protecting those who are already in these communities, in these locations, in these transit centers or these transit corridors, because it's not only rail, the transit-oriented communities also covers high-frequency bus networks. So as we think about who and what businesses are in these locations and what tools can be developed to help support and keep people in community, keep them in place. So really a focus on our more vulnerable populations, individuals with different abilities, our seniors and our youth. More and more, we're hearing stories about young adults coming out of school or moving into that first adult phase of their lives and some of the challenges that they're facing finding affordable housing. We're also looking at opportunities to work with communities in planning for stabilization and retention of existing affordable housing, whether that be the naturally occurring affordable housing or more traditional affordable housing. And also really thinking about all the investments that we as citizens have made through our taxes, through other means to support the transit investments that we have and those that are slated to come online here in short order. What are opportunities that we could take at that regional level to really truly make sure that these multi-billion-dollar investments that we've made are set up in a way to be as successful as they can be, while also being really context sensitive to the communities where these transit investments have been made. So we really are excited to be working with communities, working with planners in the areas, the 32 communities that are part of this transit-oriented communities law. On the next slide, you'll see again the slide that Amanda shared earlier of the sort of shared mitigation strategies, because really we wanted to make sure that whether you are working to make plans related to affordable housing under Senate Bill 24174, or you have a community or area where you do have transit and you also are looking at different strategies to employ. One of the benefits for those communities who are following both laws is that these are often, they support one another. So if you're using a strategy in the housing arena, there's a strong likelihood that it will also apply if you have transit. So, one strategy, multiple laws, that kind of approach to really look at ways to have that synergy in place. Now, there is one key exception that is unique to the transit-oriented communities law, and that's with small business investments. As we might imagine, around transit, we really imagine and envision really multiple uses, mixed use areas with businesses and uh, education and employment opportunities as well as residential. And so we really wanted to make sure that where we have transit and where we are looking at mitigating displacement, we really wanted to make sure that we were also supporting and providing tools to help our small businesses that exist in our transit areas. And so on the next slide, it gets into a little bit more detail here, really thinking about how can we support, promote those small businesses in our transit areas. And why this is slightly different from the housing planning is that not every residential area has the type and the level of small business that we might find in a transit area. So I think there's a small but unique difference there that definitely we wanted to point out. The next area to really kind of think about are some of the requirements related to 1313. So this legislation does ask that there be two displacement mitigation strategies identified in the transit-oriented community plans. So again, you may be leveraging an existing strategy that you already have. You might be identifying one that would apply for both the affordable housing as well as transit. So there's just a variety of ways that we can work with communities to make sure that the strategies that feel appropriate for you also can be reflected in the requirements of the law. We do have some upcoming deadlines. Our first one is now behind us. We are actively reviewing all the submissions made that were given to us in satisfaction of the June 30th deadline. So many of you will be hearing from us as we continue to go through and evaluate those submissions and engage with you in what are the next steps. One of those next steps being identifying your mitigation strategies by December 31st, 2026, if not sooner. And all of this is really leading towards transit-oriented community certification. My colleague who's going to be speaking next is going to talk about the funding that's associated to being connected or identified as a transit-oriented or a certified transit-oriented community. But those are some of the upcoming steps, and we do have some time. We have several months to work with communities to really make sure that we are calibrating and understanding the unique characteristics and needs in your community around your transit areas and your transit corridors. So there's a fair amount of work in front of us, but we're really excited about the opportunities that we see as potential outcomes of this work. Thinking about leveraging all of those multi-billion-dollar investments that we've all made, looking at setting up plans, because this is really about planning, so that the conditions can be ripe for the private sector and public sector to respond to the plans that all of you are either have or are in the process of creating for your transit area. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ashley to talk about some of the supports that we have in place to help with the implementation of this work. So thank you, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you so much, colleague Eugene. I really appreciate you. So the great thing about both of these laws is that it did actually create some funding for actually doing this work for displacement risk. So I wanted to talk about both HPLN and TOCI briefly, and then we'll go into a little bit of the funding insights just to talk about what we've seen so far. With HPLN, it's a little bit easier because we actually have already gone through 2 funding cycles with HPLN, and we've awarded almost $2 million to about 31 different projects across the state, which includes 62 jurisdictions. So even though it's a lower number of projects, there were multi-jurisdictional projects, and we really do encourage that where it makes sense, because we know that housing is not specific to only a local context, but also on a regional scale, also where it makes sense. And so talking about that, we've also included some information here about the 21 different housing action plans we have funded through HPLN so far. No one has completed that work. Very similar to what Brad was saying, is they're just getting started on this work. So you don't feel behind. A lot of that is just now beginning. And so you very much still have time to start work on that. Our third funding round for HPLN will open in November. We're having a informational session on the 13th of November, which is a Thursday, just to talk a little bit more about the grant program, what to expect throughout the application cycle. We discuss a little bit of some frequently asked questions, and then just try to answer any specific questions that folks might have. But we're also available to meet outside of that meeting anytime if you want to talk specifically about HPLN and what it can fund. We can fund new and existing, so you can do a revision to an existing plan for housing needs assessments, housing action plans, strategic growth elements of comprehensive plans, and then water supply elements of comprehensive plans. So it can really cover a wide gamut of different planning tools. And so I encourage you to look at that funding round. If you're not able to apply in this third funding round, we do anticipate having a fourth funding round, and we're thinking early spring for that, but more details to come as we get through this next one that is more immediate in the future. For TOCI, this is brand new. We are having a pilot funding round in late October, and that will be closing in early December unless it is extended depending on just timing with that. But right now, the deadline is currently the 12th of December. And so outside of that, there is time for this one as well. And the folks who are currently in the certification process or thinking about the certification process for the TOCI program, we have created a little bit of room there in terms of when that certification happens. So folks in the process of certification can apply for the funding, but the caveat there is that they need to have the certification through DOLA of being a TOC within 90 days of the notice of award. And so then we're thinking about contracting after that. And so there is a little bit of wiggle room there, but if you are planning to apply for TOCI, you would want to, in this pilot round initially, you would want to be further along in that process because there is that kind of 90-day window there. But we do anticipate having a second and final funding round in 2027 after the TOC deadline. And that will be for the other folks who are working on the certification process throughout the timeline available in the statute. So that's the overview of the grant programs. And next we'll talk about a little bit of our insights from the grant program. And this is only from 174. And primarily that's because we haven't funded anybody through TSCI. So we really don't know how much folks are asking for those types of projects. We're still in the pre-application meeting process. So more to come on that hopefully in the near future. But right now, talking about housing action plans, we have funded 21 of those. So I did use that to kind of gauge averages. What you want to think about though is that this does include some outliers of much larger jurisdictions. And so when thinking about that, it is specific to every different jurisdiction. Is your housing action plan going to take 6 months and cost X amount of dollars? It's hard to say. It will be really specific to the scope of work that you outline with whichever consultant you end up procuring. However, these are general ranges that our grantees have provided in their applications. And so I wanted to share that with you because I feel like a lot of people, that's the first question they ask me is how much is all of this going to cost? And so looking at this here, I think the easy answer is that if you are revising a plan, it costs less and doesn't take as long. I think that's a kind of obvious takeaway from that, but I will say that the revisions versus new plans are really not that disparate in how much they cost. And so when we're thinking about that, I think it's pretty solidly around an average of $50,000 to $56,000, what we've seen most often throughout those 21 that we funded. Now, by the end of the 174 funding, we'll probably have a lot more housing action plans to use as a basis for information as to how much all of these plans cost. But this is kind of some preliminary data just to get your mind wrapped around how to think about pricing these things when you're thinking about if you haven't gone through a procurement cycle yet or you haven't done a housing action plan before. I just wanted to share some of the takeaways that we've had from our grantees. So thanks to them for helping us build out that data. Speaking of building out that data, on the next slide, Brad has very graciously provided some information and intel into his grant program, or I'm sorry, his contract for his grant agreement. And they are actually doing all of the components at once, which the good news about that is that they can go through one procurement cycle or they can utilize an existing contract with folks that are already working on their comprehensive plan as kind of outlined here underneath the grant request considerations. If you do decide to use an existing contracted consultant, that is possible. However, whatever they were originally contracted for to do the work, there has to be kind of a clear nexus between that work and then what you would be doing through SB 24-174 and the HPLN grant program. And so kind of what that means is you can't necessarily take a design consultant that you procured to do a design plan on a different piece of infrastructure and then utilize them to do a housing action plan. Those things aren't necessarily connected, but if you have folks who were already procured to do your housing needs assessment, for example, and you want to utilize that same consultant because they did your housing needs assessment and you want them to do the revision, that makes sense, right? And so we wanted to provide some room and clarity around that point because we do get that question a lot. And if you haven't gone through the procurement cycle either, that is also okay to apply. If you haven't started that process, haven't thought about that process, that's okay as well. What we've kind of described to other folks who are just starting out is maybe thinking about reaching out to some consultants that have either worked with you in the past or through other means. Maybe they did a plan for a nearby jurisdiction just to see if they can provide you some non-binding quotes. Definitely want to protect the competitiveness of any procurement cycle, but just to kind of see if they they can give you a general estimate to work from based on the size of your jurisdiction and the size of the project. And that can help you back into some pricing estimates to actually go through the RFP process. So that's kind of the other route you could take if you haven't started that process at all yet. And then just going through a little bit more of what Brad has provided here. He provided the local match, which is 25% for HPLN. And so just note that it is a local cash match. You can't use in-kind resources, but they can be other grant sources. For instance, we've had folks use CDBG funds. We've had other folks use other entitlement funds. And so those can be helpful when thinking about it. Just remember that it needs to go toward the project for HPLN because that reduces your invoice once you actually submit for reimbursement. I will briefly just pause here to see if Brad wants to add anything else about this slide, but I think this is a lot of great information just to help other communities as they're starting to think about this process, especially if you're doing a scope of work that includes multiple components. So unless Brad wants to come off mute, I will pass it back to Mark.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. Let's see. So that is the end of most of our slides. Just a reminder, the link at the bottom has all of our guidance for affordability displacement, as well as housing needs assessments, housing action plans, and other things. We'll be doing an affordability strategies webinar on November the 13th at 9 a.m. Here is a reminder of the upcoming housing exchange webinars. And so at this point, if anyone has any questions, I'll stop sharing. And I think you can put those.
One question in the Q&A that Amanda answered. It was from Emily Morales asking about the deed restrictions in Vail. Amanda, I was wondering if you could maybe expand on your answer a little bit about how the deed restrictions work when they're restricted to owners and residents of a municipality.
Sure. So the way that the Vail Indeed program works is that they offer, I believe, up to $200,000 as to toward a home purchase or to homeowners that already own property, and that those funds buy a deed restriction that requires that the people who occupy that home, whether it's the homeowners themselves or whether it's renters, work at least 30 hours a week in Eagle County. And so even though there is no price restriction on what the rent can be charged, they have found that work location requirement really helps keep housing attainable, because the rents that need to be the rents that are workable for folks who live in the county are below some of the more luxury, the high end of the market.
I noticed that we also have a question related to engagement and whether or not a community should be documenting their community engagement as a requirement for our laws. Mark, I'll let you maybe speak to 174, but I would just say in general, particularly for larger jurisdictions, it's always a good practice to document any community engagement that's conducted as it relates to planning work. So I would highly encourage just that as a good best practice. But Mark, do you want to maybe speak to the requirements? Because I do believe we have some as it relates to our housing action plans.
Yeah, that's correct. Housing action plans have a pretty detailed public engagement requirement, and you actually need to have a summary report of the process that you went through when you do the housing action plan. So that's a sort of a standalone section that's going to be in the HAPs. Part of the housing action plan engagement is to have engagement for people who may not typically be able to get to a typical council meeting if it's at 5 o'clock. So having alternate meeting times or doing it in different ways to engage everyone. So I don't think there's anything in the statute that says specifically you must do X for displacement in terms of community engagement, but it should be part of the community engagement process. So I would recommend reading through the statute and the guidance, and that should answer your questions. But if not, just let us know and we'll try to give you some more information. So are there any other questions?
I'm not seeing any. I know there was a lot of information that was presented today. And so just a reminder that we will be posting all of the slides on the website, and the different program websites also have a lot of information that can help guide you through that. And the team members here are also willing to answer any questions you may have on a one-on-one basis. So it looks like we may be done. I'm not seeing any other hands being raised or questions asked. So thank you all once again for joining us today. We really appreciate you spending some time with us this morning, and we hope that we'll see you again next month on 11/20 when we are talking about middle income housing and how we can finance that. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.